Hello, this is Meredith and welcome to Marvelous French, online French lessons for those who are learning French or who would like to learn French. In this video, we're going to continue with part 2 of our Introduction to Grammar series, where we look at terms and concepts related to French grammar. In our first video, we looked at nouns, articles, and adjectives, and in this video, we're going to focus on verbs. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Verbs are words that describe an action or a state. They are often described as action words. So here are 3 examples of verbs that describe an action, known as action verbs. We have courir, which means to run, manger, to eat, and écrire, to write. So these are verbs that involve actions that have a physical component to them. Next, we have 3 verbs that describe a state of being, or a more internal process or perception. Être, to be, savoir, to know, and sembler, to seem. So these verbs don't involve physical actions, but rather a state of being, like être, or a thought process, like to know or to seem. Now we also have what are called helper verbs, or auxiliary verbs. These are verbs that in other instances can stand on their own, but that can also act as helper verbs that are used with the second main verb to tell us something about the tense or the mood of that main verb. So we have 3 examples here: avoir, être, and aller. So avoir on its own means to have, être on its own means to be, and aller on its own means to go. But once again, these verbs can also be used with the second main verb to tell us more about the tense or the mood. So let's take a closer look at helper verbs. So in our first 2 examples here, we have avoir and être, and they're actually being used to express the past tense, what's called le passé composé. So the past tense in French is made up of 2 verbs. You have your helper verb, which is either going to be avoir or être, conjugated in the present tense, and you have your main verb that's put in the past tense using what's called the past participle. Most verbs are conjugated with avoir in the past, but there are about 20 verbs that are conjugated with être. So to start with, we have avoir. J'ai parlé à mon ami. I talked to my friend. So the main verb here is parler, to talk, which we've put in the past tense with our I, with the accent aigu. And we're using avoir, ai, pronounced a in this case, which is conjugated in the present tense, and is serving the purpose of the helper verb. It's what helps us put parler in the past tense. In the next example, we have être as our helper verb. Il est tombé par terre. He fell on the ground. Our main verb is tomber, which means to fall, and tomber happens to be one of the 20 or so verbs that are conjugated with être in the past tense. So again, we're using être as our helper verb, est, pronounced e in this case, which is conjugated in the present tense, and then we have tomber in the past tense, and that gives us to fall in the past tense. Il est tombé, he fell. And finally, we have aller, which means to go. Now, aller, when used as a helper verb, actually puts our tense in the near future. So here we have an example. Nous allons regarder un film. We're going to watch a movie. In this case, regarder is a main verb, and it means to watch. Allons, which again comes from the verb aller, to go, is the helper verb that tells us that this is taking place in the future. We are going to watch. And we have the same structure in English, in fact. We're going to watch, right? In that example, going is a helper verb that's telling us that something is going to take place in the near future. So that brings us to the terms transitive and intransitive. Any given verb can be considered transitive or intransitive, and several verbs have both transitive and intransitive forms. A transitive verb is a verb that can be performed directly onto an object, a verb that does not take a preposition, and prepositions are words such as at, in, by, from, etc. So here we have 3 examples of transitive verbs: voir, which means to see, lire, to read, and chercher, which in English translates as to look for. So let's take a closer look at transitive verbs. So again, transitive verbs are verbs that do not take a preposition and whose action can be performed directly onto an object. So in our first example here, we're using voir, which means to see. And voir is transitive in both English and French. If we want to say we see something, for example, I see a car, no preposition is needed. I don't say I see to a car or I see of a car. If what I want to express is that I visually perceive a car, I'm just going to say I see a car. And it works the same way in French. Je vois une voiture. I see a car. No preposition needed, so voir is considered transitive. Lire, which means to read, works in the same way, and it's transitive in both English and French. If I want to say, for example, I'm reading a book, there's no preposition involved. I'm not reading at the book, I'm not reading under a book, I'm simply reading a book. I'm performing an action directly on the book, and it works the same way in French. Je lis un livre. I'm reading a book. Now, lire, to read, can also be used on its own. I can just say, I'm reading. Je lis. But the fact remains that we're not using a preposition, and if we're going to specify what we're reading, we would use a direct object. No preposition needed. And finally, we have the verb chercher, which in English means to look for. So in English, this verb actually does require a preposition. F-O-R, for. But in French, we don't use a preposition. For example, if I want to say I'm looking for a book, in French, I'm not going to say je cherche pour un livre. I just say je cherche un livre. There's no preposition involved. So chercher in French is transitive. And this brings up the point that you can have a verb that's transitive in French, but intransitive in English, or vice versa. So you want to make sure when you learn a verb in French to learn how that verb is used, whether or not it requires a preposition, whether or not it's transitive or intransitive in French. So then we have intransitive verbs, verbs that, unlike transitive verbs, cannot be performed directly on an object. They can sometimes be used on their own, but if you're going to link them with an object, you're going to need to use a preposition. So we have three examples here. Aller, which means to go, tomber, which means to fall, and arriver, which means to arrive. So let's take a closer look at intransitive verbs. So again, intransitive verbs can be used alone or with a preposition. And we have a couple of examples here. So aller, which means to go, is an intransitive verb. We have the example, je vais à Paris. I'm going to Paris. Okay? So once again, we're not going to be able to just say je vais Paris. I'm going Paris. We're going to need a preposition, which in this case is à, meaning to. And I have put the prepositions in all caps in these examples. So in general, we don't go things, we go to things. A preposition is required, and aller is therefore intransitive. It's a similar idea with tomber, which means to fall. I don't fall the ground, I fall on the ground in English, and it works about the same way in French. Tomber, if you're going to specify where you fall, it needs to be used with a preposition. So in this case, we have the example, je suis tombé par terre. I fell on the ground, using the preposition par. Now, tomber can also be used on its own. We can just say, I fell, je suis tombé. And in that case, we're not going to be using a preposition, but tomber is still considered intransitive because it can't be used directly on an object. It does not take a direct object. It's either used on its own or with a preposition. Now finally, we have the example arriver, which means to arrive. Elle arrive au parc. Au is a preposition here. It comes from à, meaning to. In this case, it means to the park. So again, we're not going to say she arrives park, and we're going to say she arrives to the park. And so a preposition is required, and arriver is therefore intransitive. So now let's talk about reflexive verbs. These are verbs that describe actions or thought processes that are performed on oneself. So we have three examples here. S'appeler, which means to be named, se lever, to get up, and se dire, to say to oneself. Now, we can see here that reflexive verbs are made up of two components. We have what's called the reflexive pronoun, the portion that means ourselves, se, se, or s apostrophe in front of a vowel, and the second component is the verb itself. So let's take a closer look at reflexive verbs. So here we have our three reflexive verbs, s'appeler, se lever, and se dire. Our first example, s'appeler, means to call oneself or to be named. Appeler on its own means to call, and the s apostrophe, which is short for se, means oneself. So s'appeler really translates as to be named. For example, if I want to say my name is, I'm going to say je m'appelle, which I have here in the example, where je means I, and the m apostrophe is short for me, me, myself. I call myself. In the second example here, tu t'appelles, which means you call yourself, informal. The T apostrophe is short for te, te, which means yourself. So you call yourself. We have se lever, which means to get up, as in to get up in the morning, or to stand. So lever on its own means to raise or to lift something up. We have two examples here. Je me lève, I get up, where me, me, means myself. And we have nous nous levons, we get up, where the second nous there means ourselves. We lift ourselves. And our third example, se dire, means to say to oneself, to tell oneself, or to think to oneself. So dire on its own means to say or to tell. And we have two examples, je me dis, I say to myself, where me means myself, and ils se disent, they say to themselves, where se means themselves. So in these three examples, we can see the reflexive component. We can see how an action or a thought is being performed on oneself. But there are a lot of verbs that are reflexive in French that aren't quite as logical or easy explained from a native English speaker's point of view. For example, to remember is reflexive in French, se souvenir. Now, you could argue that remembering is an internal process that requires self-reflection, but in English it really isn't reflexive. We don't remember ourselves, we just remember. So basically, reflexive verbs need to be memorized. If you look up a word and see the reflexive se included, you know it's reflexive in French. And you're going to have to remember to include the reflexive pronoun when you use the verb. You can also find lists of common reflexive verbs online or in textbooks. And of course, we'll go into more detail as far as conjugation and use of reflexive verbs in a separate video. So now let's talk about conjugation. Conjugation refers to the process of changing a verb to match the person or the tense. So for example, in English we have the verb to do, which is called the infinitive, the verb in its raw state before it's been conjugated. Now in English, infinitives start with to, to run, to read, to think, but in French, infinitives are single words. So here we have three infinitives, faire, to do, rire, to laugh, and chanter, to sing. So back to our example in English with to do. If you want to use the verb, right, you can conjugate it with I. For example, I do. Or with he does. We see that the word do changes to does to match the subject he in the last example. And this is called conjugation. Now, conjugation can also refer to the process of taking a verb and conjugating it fully with all subject pronouns. For example, if I want to conjugate to do, present tense, I do, you do, he, she, it does, we do, they do. So that's what conjugation refers to. Now in French, verbs fall into two categories as far as conjugation, regular and irregular. Now as far as regular verbs go, there are three categories based on their endings. Regular ER verbs, which end in ER, regular IR verbs ending in IR, and regular RE verbs ending in RE. So we have three examples of regular verbs here. Habiter, to live, which is a regular ER verb. Finir, to finish, a regular IR verb. And vendre, to sell, a regular RE verb. So each of these three categories follow a set pattern of conjugation. And once you know the pattern, for example, for regular ER verbs like habiter, you can take any random regular ER verb and follow the same pattern to conjugate it. Now, irregular verbs do not follow the set patterns of regular ER, IR, or RE verbs, so their conjugation has to be memorized for the most part. Now, here's three examples of irregular verbs: prendre, to take; être, to be; and vouloir, to want. Now, in addition to conjugating verbs to match with the subject, verbs can also be conjugated in different tenses or moods. So I've listed three examples of common tenses. We have the present tense, the equivalent of I do. We have the past tense, I did, and the imperfect tense, I was doing. Now, I've also listed some common moods here. We have the indicative mood, which is sort of the default. It's used to talk about things that tend to be facts or reality. For example, I am American. We also have the subjunctive mood that's more subjective. That tends to be used when we're talking about perception, desire, possibility, emotion, etc. So now let's take a look at some sentences using different conjugations of the verb faire, which means to do. So here we have the verb faire, to do, conjugated in some different tenses and moods. So to start with, we have faire conjugated fully in the present tense. Je fais, which is I do; tu fais, you do; il fait, he does; nous faisons, we do; vous faites, you do; ils font, they do. Now, faire is an irregular verb, so these conjugations would just need to be memorized. But here's an example sentence. Il fait ses devoirs. He's doing his homework. Or, he does his homework. Now we have an example of faire put in the past tense. Il a fait ses devoirs. Okay? So the a and the fait together give us the past tense. Here's another example of le passé composé using the helper verb avoir, in this case just the letter A. Il a fait. Now we have an example of faire in the imperfect. Il faisait ses devoirs. He was doing his homework, where the F-A-I-S-A-I-T is a portion that can be translated to was doing, the imperfect tense. Now finally, we have some examples of our moods, indicative and subjunctive. So actually the examples we gave for the present, for the past, and the imperfect are in what is called the indicative mood. This is our default mood. Most of the time it's used to discuss facts or reality. So again, I have the present tense sentence, il fait ses devoirs. Fait there comes from faire, to do. Translation, he's doing his homework. Straightforward fact, we're using the indicative mood. Now, if we compare that with the subjunctive, I have an example sentence here. Je veux qu'il fasse ses devoirs. I want him to do his homework. Literally, I want that he does his homework. Fasse, F-A-S-S-E, in all caps, is the subjunctive form of our verb faire. So if we compare il fait ses devoirs, he's doing his homework, with I want him to do his homework, je veux qu'il fasse ses devoirs, we have fait versus fasse. And in our subjunctive sentence, it's not really reality. It's not that he is doing his homework, but I want him to do his homework. I'm expressing a desire. And this in French requires the subjunctive. So that brings us to the end of this introduction to verbs. Of course, we will have several individual videos going over a lot of the concepts that we briefly covered today. But in the meantime, if you found this video helpful, please feel free to like, share, comment, and subscribe. So once again, this was Marvelous French with Meredith, and as usual, à la prochaine! See you next time.